In 1951, key members of the China Inland Mission family were still under house arrest in China. Others were in their home countries, healing from the physical and emotional scars of war and communist interrogation. A few were already exploring Thailand, along with other evangelical missions refocusing after China.
After a reluctant exodus from China in 1951, the following year 4 of us from England arrived in Bangkok to join a small group from the USA.
A sense of urgency pushed them forward to seize this final, fleeting opportunity in a land that largely had never had a first chance to hear the good news of the Lord Jesus Christ. CIM agreed to meet the challenge of 3 areas with radical spiritual and medical needs. The tribal peoples of the northern mountain forests, as CIM had lived among the same peoples in China. Secondly, the Malay of the southern end of the long spine of Thailand, with their 80% ethnic, language and religious distinctiveness. Thirdly, the 13 provinces, later 9, of the vast central plains and uplands, where the only missionary known to stay had been a sick one, who died and was buried while being conveyed by river barge from Chiangmai to Bangkok. Everyone arrived by boat up till 1968. Dr. Chris and Dr. Catherine Maddox, assigned to head up the medical thrust, were accompanied by a giraffe headed for Bangkok Zoo. Its appetite was conveniently located at passenger deck, while its feet were in steerage. Doctors John and Anne Townsend were so excited about starting their mission that they left the baby lying in her carry-cot on the wharf. Thailand's lush green paddies and forests and its tranquil lakes were so different from the dry dust of China. But they hid a spiritual barrenness and a dark murkiness that the pioneers were yet to confront. For now, they were optimistic that God had led them to these green pastures and still waters for a good purpose. The atmosphere in the rented wooden house between Silom and Saturn Roads in Bangkok was excited and family. Everyone was immediately part of the action.
Water was a precious commodity, and there was little or no nam rabah. In the event of a nocturnal, monsoonal downpour, everyone from the superintendent Cyril Faulkner down to the newest missionary leapt out of bed, grabbed their bucket and rushed out in their pyjamas or frilly nighties to help fill the huge water ongs. It was good fellowship and a lot of fun.
Language learners practiced as they evangelized. They poised, ready to point to a colourful poster.
Our group arrived in Bangkok by boat from Singapore on New Year's Eve 1956. Next day we were up at 5:20 and Kay Lederach took us in the car to a park, I think it was Lumpini Park, to sell copies of Genesis and the Gospels and give out tracts. So in our faltering Thai we called out Ha Lem Nung Bad. Later we learned it should have been Tut Labad. So we began our missionary service in Thailand.
Actually, we were put to work as soon as we stepped off the ship in Bangkok, for Kay Lederach of OMF Publishers roped us into action. She gave each of us a shoulder bag full of sets of scriptures, told us how to say Halim Badil, then took us around the many markets in Bangkok every Saturday, and we sold out each time.
CIM pioneered such literature resources from the one-room business under Kay Lederach, called Christian Witness Press. Today, Kanok Banasan remains the principal producer of evangelistic material in Thailand. Dorothy Bugler wrote an authoritative manual on Buddhism in Thailand and tried to maintain the strict disciplines of senior and junior missionaries as endured by the old China hands. Doctors swatted up for the Thailand exam to gain license to practice. nurses visited McCain Hospital in Chiangmai and studied leprosy treatment under Dr. Booker.
I reached Thailand on April the 15th, 1956, after starting language study at Singapore. I was in Bangkok for a month, doing language study and also preparing for the medical exam.
The children became Chifu School, Bangkok, and were allowed to attend the very first Thailand Field Conference in November 1952. Old China Hand himself was Cyril Faulkner, who with and without Dr. Chris Maddox hunted for houses to get going in each province. Church planting stations were opened as soon as places and personnel became available. Some accommodation was cramped.
Holding your conference near Saiburi activated my mind, for it was my first mission station. There in 1955 I was initiated into grassroots missionary work. Then there was the open-air preaching in front of the railway station every Sunday morning, and we all had to take part. For all of us, including our senior missionary, were still learning the language.
First believers were in Nakhon a 16-year-old schoolgirl followed by Taylor Cheng Wu, an immigrant from China. Next was a young man with leprosy referred from McCain and registered as the very first clinic patient. Outreach was tough, with no known Christians and few roads. Motor traffic was in its infancy. There was the one railway. George Harris rode the train to and fro across the southern border and revelled in the freedom to enjoy in-depth conversations and hand out literature. There were farm tracks for ox carts and push bikes. The most responsive people seemed to be those in the most remote places. There were the rivers. A mini ferry bought in Bangkok and called Maranatha was ideal for the transparent Christian witness of two single men on the waterways. But missionaries need some privacy, and Isaac Scott supervised the building of a more suitable boat in Bac Nam Po, launched under the name Santi Suk. As romances blossomed into marriage, couples moved on board, and as children were born, moved on shore again. Leprosy clinics in salas on the outskirts of town were set up in Chainat, Utai, Lopburi and Singburi. The number grew and grew as over 1,000 shy sufferers risked exposure and hope dawned again. They were pioneered by nurses like Ruth Adams or Barbara Morgan, who had been preparing for leprosy care of Nosu peoples in southwest China before the reluctant exodus. Dr. June Morgan became the leprosy doctor. Being a woman, she could stay overnight in a host's cramped quarters with the nurses without extra gossip. Gossip was already bad enough. What sin have these women committed in their own country that they have to come here and make so much merit? The incidence of leprosy was alarmingly high, as it was both feared, seen as a sign of bad karma, and therefore ignored for serious treatment. Endemic tuberculosis, cholera, malaria, smallpox, polio, and hemorrhagic fever made the leprosy victim's life even more dismal. Dr. Chris kept the pressure on to get Christian medical clinics started. Inburi was first, in a ramshackle house with no water or electricity. It teetered over its little jetty on the Chao Phraya River. Next was Wiset Chai Chan in Antong. The one in Saiburi in the south was in 3 hongtels, or shop houses, on the main thoroughfare to the beach. But Dr. Chris's aim was a Christian hospital. He and Cyril Faulkner were in the middle of negotiating for a block of land in Chainat town, but they had to cross the river at Manram to visit the nurses in Utai. Cyril was feeling rotten with a rising fever. He slumped in a coffee shop. Interested people asked their business and immediately offered a land donation and an official's blessing to get the hospital located at Manarum instead of Chainat. The hospital opened August 18, 1956, in the middle of a monsoon downpour. It's a good luck omen, cheered locals. The missionaries praised God. The next Sunday, the first 6 were baptized, all young men. They included Somjit Clark at Wiset Clinic, Arpon, the ex-monk from Lewis and Stella Ammon's ministry in Bak Nam Po, and now business manager of the hospital. Sam Young, the Ligue actor, was then a conscripted night duty nurse aide, but later he pastored Manoram Church as Pastor Song San. Sam Young wrote his first song then, Today is the Day of Peace. Other significant baptisms included the young Mr. Toop from Singburi. He and his wife met and worked at the hospital. Another was Mr. Jer in Utai. He built an enlarged property to shelter at-risk women and children. His wife continues this ministry today. The first church was opened in Utai in 1953. God was providing the infant church with strong pillars for the future, and the vast majority had leprosy. On Christmas Day 1957, the first 6 were baptized in the south, all Thai Chinese. Sam Young's second song was about December 25th and its importance. Mary Cook had students sing it as a choir and took the recording round to the Nakhon Sawan radio station. Great publicity. Nowhere was the celebrating of the wonderful love of God at Christmas more precious than in the Sala clinics. The missionaries made the most of shared meals with Thai friends. Roland Bell and Lewis Hammond moved the short-term Bible schools up a notch and ran evening Bible schools as believers became serious students. Dr. Chris kept pushing, and the 2-storied hospital building was completed just ahead of the huge flood of 1958. Formation of the Christian Leprosy Foundation opened up the way to purchase land, although most churches were too small for more than meeting in homes or salas. But the Manoram Church moved out of OPD and put in its foundation stone. Nongbo Hospital opened in the Wild East with 20 beds but clinic status in 1962. 4 or 5 day-long believers' conferences became the rich centre of baptisms, fellowship and spiritual blessing. The pattern of pioneer church planting seemed to be successfully in place. Now the missionaries began to think longer term, and the first of their precious ones were buried in the soil of the new harvest field. Little Janet Tootle in the Protestant Cemetery, Bangkok, George Harris's wife in Saiburi, and Lillian Hamer in Chiangmai.